When you look at the changes in our marriage and divorce statistics, when you look at the extraordinary proportion of young Australians who are either avoiding or postponing marriage in record numbers, it's tempting to say marriage as an institution has gone out of fashion. And if that were so, that of course would really change the Australian social landscape. And it does look like that until you look at our remarriage statistics. And then you realise that there's a group of people in the community who love getting married so much that they just want to keep doing it. And so we're rapidly becoming, in the marriage market, like many consumer markets. Of the rising generation, it'll probably be true that about a third will be non-users, that is, never marry. About a third will be light users who marry once and stay married. And about a third will be heavy users who marry 2 or more times. And we're already rapidly heading in that direction. Well, 30 years ago, most people who got married had kids if they were capable of having kids. They were typically having 3 or 4 kids. In fact, 40 years ago, the birth rate was 3.6 babies per woman. Today, we know what's happened to the birth rate. It's half that. We're down to 1.8 babies per woman. Those children were typically born to mothers in their early to mid-20s. The average age of the mother at the birth of the first child was 23. The average age of here's another turn of the kaleidoscope, the average age of the mother at the birth of the first child today is 31. That's not a trend. That's another fracture of a trend. Our birth rate has gone through the floor. It was even lower a couple of years ago than it is now. It has picked up slightly, and of course Peter Costello was taking personal credit for that. Just give them enough money, he said, as he handed out a $5,000 baby bonus. Give them enough money and they'll breed. Why, incidentally, you would want to get the birth rate up, given the state of the planet, is an interesting question, but that's not a question for today's discussion. But yes, the birth rate has picked up slightly in the last 12 to 18 months. That's almost certainly a very temporary blip on the way to an even lower birth rate, looking ahead for the next 10 to 15 years. We're probably heading in the direction of countries like Britain and Italy and other Western European countries whose birth rates are already much lower than ours. Well, why has the birth rate gone through the floor? Many reasons always for these things. There's never anyone who gives you a simple answer is having you on. There's always a complicated set of answers, but there are a couple of big factors at work here. One is, in Australia and all around the Western world in particular, you can see the relationship. The more highly educated the female population, the lower the birth rate. It's just the case at the moment, as we go through this stage of our social evolution, that more highly educated and more affluent women tend to have fewer babies than less well-educated and poorer women. So that trend is likely to go on for a while until we find a new way of adapting to that, and then we'll probably see the birth rate rising again. But in Australia, for example, the most highly educated female population is in Canberra, and Canberra also has the lowest birth rate in Australia, and that's not just a coincidence. That's the way it goes. So if you really did want to get the birth rate up, you know what you'd have to do. But we won't contemplate the strategy of banning women from universities. We've been there. But the other big factor, of course, driving the birth rate down is the attitudes, the ethos, the values, the aspirations of this rising generation of young Australians, now in their late teens, early, mid, late 20s, the generation that's often rather foolishly called Generation Y, which doesn't convey anything. I prefer to call them the options generation. They're a generation who, if we care to study them, will tell us most of what we want to know about what Australia will become. Listen to them, watch them, observe them, attend to them, because they are the signpost to ways in which our culture will evolve over the next 10, 15, 20 years. Now, what are they like? Well, whatever the answer to that question might be, the explanation for what they're like is very simple. They are the product of a kaleidoscopic society. They are the product of 25 or 30 years of relentless social, economic, cultural, technological upheaval. And if you grow up in a society where things just keep changing and the rate of change continues to accelerate, and by the way, this is not a unique Australian phenomenon, of course. You can observe this generation in societies like ours all around the world, the same kind of phenomenon. A generation who grow up in that kind of environment learn something. Of course, they learn to be nimble, adaptable, flexible, but they also learn, and it's built into their psyche, they learn to keep their options open. It becomes their generational ethos to hang loose, wait and see. What's next? Their defining generational question is, what else is there? And they're asking that question whether they're talking about a sexual partner or a course of study or a job, or a musical genre, or a make of motor car, or a fashion label, or whatever it might be. Yeah, this is great, I'm enjoying this, but what else is there? There are all these other options, and I want to explore them. Now, a generation that is thinking like that is a generation almost certain to drive the marriage rate and the birth rate even lower. They're not going to rush parenthood. They're not going to rush marriage, and incidentally, they're not going to rush mortgages either. Even though we talk a lot about the crisis in housing affordability for the young, and there is a crisis in housing affordability, there is also the fact that there's such an increase in the number of young people renting and a reluctance for them to get into a mortgage at the age their parents did. Renters now outnumber buyers in the 25 to 35 age group in the housing market. It's not just about affordability, it's also about generational ethos. It's a generation who like the idea of renting. That's a way of hanging loose. That's the way of, one way of staying flexible and keeping your options open. Well, one other little observation before we leave the subject of the falling birth rate. Let's reflect on this. What it means is that at the moment we are in the process of producing, relative to total population, not in raw numbers, but relative to total population, we are in the process of producing the smallest generation of kids Australia has ever produced. It's an odd thing to think about. 50 years ago, we were producing proportionally the largest generation of kids we'd ever produced. Now, exactly the opposite. Lots of questions arise from that. We won't this morning explore them all, but there are some obvious things to be said. One is the ageing of the population that we keep hearing about endlessly is a direct result of this, combined with, of course, increasing longevity due to improved public health, medical intervention, all the other reasons we know about. But certainly, if you reduce the supply of infants coming in, you're going to skew the age distribution of the population, and that's happening. By the middle of the century, 25% of the Australian, in fact before then, by 2040, 25% of the Australian population will be over 65. I don't know whether that's good or bad news for your industry, but it's a very different kind of Australia from the one today where 13% of the population are over the age of 65. Another interesting question that arises from our falling birth rate is this: what is it going to be like to be these kids? We've talked a bit about what it's like to be the 15 to 30s at the moment, the late teens, the 20s, but what's it going to be like to be a member of the smallest generation of kids Australia has ever produced? I think they're going to have quite a tough time. It's already becoming obvious some of the burdens they're going to carry. One is the burden of overzealous parenting. When the birth rate falls, parents tend to get a bit worked up about being parents, more than usual. Go into any bookshop today and you can see many books on the subject of parenting. Now, parenting was a word that wasn't even in our language a generation ago. Parents just got on with their lives and hoped the kids would notice what was happening. Now there's this art or science called parenting. We're about to be invaded by a spate of television programs replacing home renovations about parenting. And this is a symptom of the fact that when the birth rate falls, parents become much more almost obsessive about the well-being of their children. The children are likely to be overindulged. The phenomenon of helicopter parenting is now obvious in Australia. The parents who are hovering over their children at home, in the park, in the school, wherever they are. The parents who are down at the school all the time saying, you know, is he falling behind with his reading? He's only 5. Now, my son got dropped to the B team. You know, how could this be? I only got one son. I've only got one child. You know, he's got to have a perfect life. I've got to be a perfect parent. In my new book, I quote a parent who went to the local primary school to complain about her son being dropped to the B team and requesting that all the teams be renamed A, so that no child would be disadvantaged simply by a lack of ball skills. Well, there's going to be more of that stuff around. We saw what happened in China with the one-child policy. It produced the so-called Little Emperor syndrome. Well, in Australia, I think we're developing our own version. The Little Prince and Princess syndrome is already apparent. Now, that's going to be tough for the kids. I think we can confidently predict in 10 to 15 years from now we'll probably have the most obnoxious and rebellious generation of adolescents we've ever seen, as they're trying to say to their parents, get off our backs, let us get on with our lives, let us have some independence. Another burden they're going to carry is something we can also observe around the Western world, and certainly increasingly in Australia, and that is, in a low birth rate society, the society tends to become less child-friendly. And this is an odd thing for Australia. It's another big culture shift that's underway. We've been a remarkably child-including, child-accommodating, child-tolerating kind of society, but that's starting to change under the influence of the falling birth rate. When there aren't as many kids around, we're not so keen on kids being around, and this is an odd cultural phenomenon. It's also, of course, fed by the fact that we now have more non-parents, and will have over the next 15 years more non-parents in our adult population than we've ever had before, because the falling birth rate is not just a function of women having fewer kids, but of more women having no kids. So here are kids who are going to be growing up in homes where they're being told they're the most precious creatures on earth, and then they move out into a society in which they're finding that perhaps people are not quite so interested, not quite so tolerant of kids as they once were. You can already hear it in people saying things like, we went out for dinner last Saturday night, you wouldn't believe what happened, the people at the next table had brought kids, you know, as though they'd smoked or done some other outrageous antisocial thing. Well, the child-free restaurant is now in demand, the child-free resort, the child-free apartment block. In southeast Queensland a couple of years ago, the first development application for a child-free housing estate. Well, there's more of this in our future. And that, I think, is another burden that these kids are going to carry. There's already pent-up demand, quite obviously, for the child-free flight, especially international flights. But Qantas and Virgin and co haven't cottoned on to the fact that they could charge a premium for that. Well, who would have imagined 30 years ago that today in Australia there would be 1 million dependent kids, 1 million dependent kids living with just one of their natural parents? Who would have imagined 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, that today in Australia 500,000 dependent kids would be on the move once a week or once a fortnight from the home of the custodial parent to the home of the non-custodial parent for an access visit? Mass migration. 500,000 kids on the move, mass migration, for many of them mass pain, mass trauma, mass dislocation for the kids, for their parents, for the micro-communities that they're moving in and out of. All of these things are things we didn't think we would be coping with in these early years of the new century. Almost 25% of Australian families are now single-parent families. Well, many of those changes, of course, are as a result of one of the greatest of all the revolutions of the 20th century, namely the gender revolution. And if you think the gender revolution is over, think again. It's one of those revolutions that will keep on evolving. Talk to young women today about feminism and the gender revolution, and they say, we're not feminists. They don't like the word feminist. They love the word liberation, but they've redefined it. They say all those hard-line, pioneering feminists, they thought liberation meant you've got to be married and have kids and run a household and have a full-time job. So they watched their mothers do that and wear themselves out and lose their sense of humour and end up living on a short fuse. They say she was exhausted. She was enslaved by her liberation. We're not going to do that. Liberation to us means we're free to choose. The options generation again. We'll be whatever kind of woman we want to be, and we'll be lots of different kinds of woman at different stages of our journey. So that revolution has a long way to run. We don't know. Perhaps it's a continuously evolving process. We've come a long way, but we have a long way still to go. Let me just quickly mention a couple of other of the major changes, and then I want to say a bit about how this is affecting us at the moment. Another major change has been the shrinking of the Australian household. We hear a lot about this. It's interesting, I think, to look at the actual figures involved in what's happening to the Australian household. We've been shrinking, by the way, for 100 years. In the last 100 years, the Australian population has increased fivefold, but the number of Australian households has increased tenfold. So we've been creating households at twice the rate we've been growing the population, which means, of course, our households are getting smaller. They're getting smaller to the extent that today more than half, just over 50%, about 52% of all Australian households contain just one or two people. The biggest single category and the fastest growing category of Australian households is the single person household. It already accounts for about 26 or 27% of all Australian households, and the Bureau of Statistics says by the year 2026, so in whatever that is, not 20 years away, 18 years away, 34% of all Australian households will contain just one person. Now that's a very different kind of society from the one that all of us grew up in. That's how quickly that rate of shrinkage is accelerating. What it means is that now, today, if you live alone or with just one other person, then in terms of household statistics, you're positively mainstream. Here's a really odd case. If you live with your spouse, someone you're actually married to, and it's the only person you've ever been married to, and you're currently living with 3 or more of your very own children and no one else's, then in terms of household demographics, you're now part of the eccentric fringe. That's how Australia has changed. Well, what does that mean for us? What happens to a society when so many of us choose, or even if we don't choose, find ourselves living on our own? And in many cases, of course, we are choosing to live in smaller households. What's happened to the famous human herd instinct? The herd instinct that means we typically like living, working, socialising with herd-sized groups, which are typically 5 to 8 people. That's the size of the human herd. That's the size of a good dinner party. Invite 10 or 12 people and you'll have 2 dinner parties because it's too big to be a herd. It's the right size for a work group. It's the right size for a management span of control. So that's what thousands of years of human history tell us is a comfortable herd for the sense of identity, the sense of emotional security we get from being connected. Well, the herd used to be a domestic herd. 100 years ago, we lived in households that were typically of that size. What happens when the household shrinks to the point where it's way below herd size? You can't have a herd of 1. You can't have a herd of 2 or 3 or even 4 is not really a human herd. And the answer, of course, is, and this is another signpost to further social change, the answer is we look beyond the domestic herd for other herds to connect with. The book club herd, for example, an extraordinary phenomenon in Australian society over the last 10 years has been the hundreds of thousands of people who've joined book clubs. Now, most of those people, of course, love reading and love talking to their friends about the books they read, but when you hear people describing the meeting of their book club, what they typically say is, at some point in the evening, someone always says, "Don't you think we should say something about the book?" In other words, we're herding, and the book is a convenient excuse, but it might be an investment club, it might be a choir, it might be a bushwalking club, it might be a drinking club, it might be any kind of, it might be a work group. any kind of association that gives us the sense of belonging to the human herd. The easiest way of connecting with the herd, of course, is simply to graze with the herd, which is why the explosion of coffee shops and cafes and restaurants and food courts, don't you like that expression, food court, the sort of euphemism for the public trough, where you just go out and find a convenient paddock and plonk yourself down with the other cattle and chomp contentedly. You don't even have to moo if you're not feeling particularly sociable, but you have the sense of connecting with the herd. Well, there's no accident that all that stuff has exploded in direct proportion to the shrinkage of the Australian household. And in fact, household shrinkage, which many people are worried about, may turn out to be very good news for the life and development of our local neighbourhoods and communities, because we do need to connect, and we're going to find some way of connecting.